Hi guys, this is Ivan from Skills Build Training. This channel is all about showing you how to become a highly paid IT pro fast. In today's video, I'm going to show you how to use Microsoft's cloud platform, Azure. Thank you for choosing to watch this video. To help us help more people like you, please like, comment, and subscribe. Also, remember to hit the notification bell so that you'll get notified of our future videos. Let's get started. We hear a lot about computing being done in the cloud, but what does that really mean, and what skills does an IT need? We will define what cloud computing is and how Microsoft provides these services through Azure. More importantly, I will show you how to start practical projects that are part of the Microsoft Azure certification requirements. So let's start with what is a cloud provider. It's basically a company that provides these three following main services. The first one is infrastructure as a service. Now let's define the word compute. Compute is anytime you have a server that has a processor, it has RAM, it has built-in memory. So that's what you mean when you're saying compute. So it's anytime they provide compute, storage, and networking resources that allow an organization to run operations in the cloud that were previously managed on premises. Now the next type of cloud providing is called platform as a service. And what this means is the provider manages the infrastructure and the resources needed to run an application. So they might provide the compute, the storage, the networking, even the basic runtimes and dependencies, but the application itself is run by the person or company that is actually paying for the service. The final level is called software as a service, or SaaS. This is where the provider manages all staging of provisioning resources, infrastructure, and the application itself. A very good example of this is Azure Directory. You don't have to set up any of the servers. You don't have to set up, how Azure Directory is installed. All you have to do is use Azure Directory, as if some other IT, which is literally what happened, some other IT had set it up for you. So it's a really nice way sometimes if you want to avoid the overhead but get the usage. So let's look at these diagrams because this might help you a little more, where they actually show the different layers of a cloud deployment, and they'll show what it means when you're just doing infrastructure as a service. So you're choosing the OS, you're dealing with middleware, runtime, the data, and the applications. Where the provider, in this case Microsoft, is just dealing with the actual hardware here, networking, virtualization. Now if you do platform as a service, as you can see, they're dealing with the OS, middleware, runtime. So they've already created the virtual machines that you're going to need. All you're doing is putting the application in the data. And then, as I mentioned, software as a service is where they are completely controlling the application, the security of the application, things like that. All you need to do at that point is use it, and hopefully with best practices. Now, finally, as far as the slide portion of this video goes, we have the methods of deploying cloud resources. There's three different types of deployments. You have a public cloud. This is where resources are owned and operated by the provider. On Azure, each customer is known as a cloud tenant. Tenants share hardware, software, and networking resources across Azure infrastructure. Then you have what's called a private cloud. The resources are dedicated only to one tenant. The actual infrastructure could be located on-premise or hosted by a provider like Azure. But what you want to remember here is that it's still being managed by Azure. It's still going to be infrastructure, platform, or SaaS provided by Azure, but it's private. It's only one tenant. Then we have hybrid cloud. And this is where resources are located on both private and public clouds. This often is used when some critical services are kept on premises, while other applications take advantage of a public cloud deployment. So sometimes an organization might have audit requirements where they can't put certain resources on the public cloud, and so they have to keep them private. Again, that doesn't mean they're necessarily on premises. They could be, or they could be in, an Azure private cloud offering. But the point is, when you hear hybrid, it means that some of it's private, some of it's public. So you have the mixture there. And those are the 3 ways of deploying cloud resources.
Okay, so now I've logged in to what's called the Azure Portal, the resource panel. And as you can see from here, you can manage your subscriptions, your resource groups. You can look at different dashboards. This is something important. You can access your Azure Active Directory. There you can control identity, you can create logins, username, passwords that then you can apply to applications that you might be running. So let's say you put a web app up and you want to use this to control accounts. It's very useful. You can click on all resources and you'll see anything that you might have. If you click on this little box here, again, you have those same types of abilities. So let's get started. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take an approach where we build things from the ground up. You could actually just say create a VM and create everything when you create the VM. But I want to show you how to do things step by step in case you're not just putting virtual machines up when you start. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a resource group. A resource group is basically a label so that you know that everything is part of a particular project or it belongs to a particular part of your company maybe. So for this one, we're going to create the resource group and you're going to give the subscription that it's under. So in here, this one's just called Azure Subscription 1. Now I'm going to give this a name that makes sense for what I'm doing. So I'm just going to put Azure Tutorial as my resource group. Now I happen to be on the West Coast, so I'm going to move this to US West. Resource regions, by the way, that has to do with where those resources are going to be based. So for instance, any virtual machines I use or any services that I might add to this are all going to be in the West Coast. Okay. Now I could add tags if I wanted to. Let's just do that just so you can see what I'm doing. Let's just say we'll call this YouTube channel. And then this is going to be skills, build, learning. So that way I know that the YouTube channel that this tutorial is on is skills, build, learning. So now I can review and create. Okay, so subscription, resource group, and I even put a tag so that all of these will be tagged now with skills, build, learning. Later on, if I wanted to look up resources that had to do just with skills, build, learning, I'd be able to do that. So I'm going to go ahead and create it. And so I've created my resource group, which is the first step when putting new resources onto Azure. Next resource that we're going to create for this project is the virtual network. That's the network that we'll be putting all our resources in. So we're going to create a resource. As you can see, there's all sorts of things you can create in Azure. The amount is actually staggering and impressive. So we're going to go to networking. We're going to choose virtual network. So we're going to choose that resource group we've already made. We're going to keep our naming schema here. So we're just going to call this tutorial network. Okay. Go down here, next, set the IP addresses for this. They've already created the general space that I'm going to use, so we're just going to leave that. As you can see, it's the standard 10.0/16, which is a very useful range. Now, we could actually just use this default subnet, but just for the sake of naming schema, we're going to create our own, and we're going to call it tutorial subnet. And then we're going to put this one at the 10.0.1.0/24 range. Create service endpoints. No, we're just going to add this now. So we have that. Next, we're going to look at the security. We don't have it's now a Bastion host is whether or not we're going to create an Azure Bastion service, and we will be doing this, but I want to show this in a separate section, because if we click it now, see, it's going to ask us for what Bastion name we're going to be using. So we're going to set that up separately is what we're going to do, because we haven't created that yet. Do we want DDoS protection? We'll just leave that on basic for now. And as far as the firewall goes, we're also going to leave that service disabled now. We'll just use standard security groups for that. Now, do we want to add a tag? Again, we're going to use that same tag, the YouTube channel, and we'll put skills build learning, so we know that it's part of the same general setup. So now we're going to do review and create. And so now it's creating our virtual network for us, and depending on, there we go, validation. I was going to say depending on your system, the connection can take a while, but we got validation passed, and we can create that now. So now it's confirmed that it's initializing it on the resource group, and our deployment's underway. And deployment is succeeded. So now we can go to the resource group, and if we need to change things about this, we can do it from here. And then we can also see right now that there's no devices or anything connected to it. So there you go. That's how to create a virtual network. When you create a virtual network, you can control the traffic that goes in and out the same way you would with the firewall, using what they call network security groups. I highly recommend reading this section of the Microsoft documentation on security groups and how they work. But like I said, they're very similar to how traditional firewall rules work, and that you can allow or deny traffic into different zones. Usually you would want to associate a network security group with a particular subnet that you've created. So we're going to go ahead and show you how to create one, and then we'll start with some basic rules for it. So we're going to create a resource, come in here, and it's going to be under networking once again, and we're going to come to network security group. Notice that they do have links to quick start guides and tutorials. So if you're confused about something, a lot of the time they'll have these learn more, or in this case even tutorials that you can link to. But here we'll show you as well, so that's good. So we have our resource group. Again, we're going to do Azure tutorial. We're going to give this a name, so we're going to call this our tutorial security group. Again, we want it in the same region. Then we're going to go to our tags. And I'm going to keep tagging everything the way I did, because I want to be able to search for that all at once. So then review and create. Okay, it's passed its validation test. And now we're going to create it. Okay, so deployment's underway. And we can actually tell it to go ahead and go to the resource. As you can see, it has default rules put in. So you'll want to know what those default rules mean. On the virtual network, they're allowed in. On the Azure load balancer on inbound, anything's being allowed in. And then finally, it has a default for anything else coming in is being denied. So right now, nothing can go in from the outside. So it's not available publicly, which is a good thing and as a default. Again, outbound on your virtual network is by default being allowed. You're allowing internet connection so that you can do things, like administrate things. You're allowing outbound connections. And then finally, anything that's not covered by those two, though, are being denied. So this is when you're going to start going to your security rules and you're going to start adding your own rules. And we'll get into that once we set up a virtual machine that we'll use this with. And then also, we're going to want to go ahead and associate this with our subnet. So we go down to subnets, and I believe we can actually search that subnet. No, it's not associated yet. So we got to click associate, and then choose our virtual network, and then choose our subnet. So we're going to go ahead and do it with the tutorial subnet. Okay, so now anything that is in the tutorial subnet is being managed by the tutorial security group. So that's a really good way, by the way. Did you notice how I did that where I use the same prefix? Because in that way it's all being, in my mind, I know, okay, this is for the tutorial. The tutorial subnet goes with the tutorial network, goes with the tutorial security group. So naming schemas are important. Okay, so again, we can start seeing that our recent resources, you start seeing those. Again, if we go to all resources, we can actually see what we've already created. But now we're going to create one of the most common things that you're going to be using. And what we're going to do is we're going to go to compute, and we're going to create a virtual machine. So basically, we're going to actually set up a server that's on Azure. So we're going to go ahead and do that. And we'll set it up from scratch just so you know how to do that. Okay, so we're going to create the virtual machine. Basics first. Again, we're going to use that same tutorial resource group. We got to give it a name. So we're just going to call this tutorial VM 1. Oh, doesn't want my numbers. It doesn't want my underscores either. So we're just going to call this tutorial VM then. Okay, so that's its naming schema. It doesn't want me to use my underscores that I like to use. Okay, we're not going to use availability for this. I mean, if you were setting up, let's say, a production environment, you would want to have some sort of availability option set up where, let's say, US West failed for some reason. Well, then you could actually put a backup in West US 2. So that if Azure had a down, an outage in this region, then it would fail over directly to West US 2. But we're not going to do that for this setup. Spot instance, again, that's where you can actually auto create instances as your needs increase. So like, let's say you had a web server and all of a sudden you had a huge spike in traffic. Well, with an Azure Spot instance, it would actually automatically scale these for you. We're not going to set that up here, but you can. For size, there's all sorts of standard sizes that you can choose from. And we're going to use, we are going to use the Ubuntu 18 for our image, and we're just going to leave it with this recommended here. So it's recommending that we have the 2 virtual CPUs, the 8 gigs of RAM, and then it gives us what our approximate monthly amount to run this server if we were to leave it running the whole time. So authentication type, you can use a password. I don't suggest it. I suggest using an SSH public key. So we're going to do that. Username, we'll just leave it as Azure user. We can use the default for now. You can always change that to whatever you want to create when you create it. We're going to generate a new pair because we don't have any key pairs. Notice the key pair name automatically generated for me, so I'm just going to leave that there. And then it's asking if I want to put any import rules for this. And what it's suggesting is that I leave the SSH port open because it's saying, that's how I'm going to be getting to this virtual machine. In this case, we're going to do this. Later on, I'll show you an even better way of accessing your VMs. But for this first VM, we're going to go ahead and just show you how to do it directly with port 22. So we're going to leave that open. Okay, we're just going to downgrade this. For tutorial purposes, we don't need a very fast machine. So we're just going to do a standard HDD. Notice you also have a standard solid state device or a premium solid state device you can choose from. And then of course they'll give you the different reasons to use different levels. Encryption type, we'll use the default, which is the at rest with a platform managed key. Obviously you have a lot of more options on how to do this, which is the enable ultra-disk compatibility. You can read more about that. If you want, you can add and configure other disks for it to be using. So if you wanted to, you could put more virtual hard drives. Let's say you had one already set up and you wanted this VM to use it as well. You could actually create and attach those. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and go to its networking. Tutorial network's already been put in there, although we're going to want to move it to our tutorial subnet. It's going to create a new public IP for us. Again, for this particular virtual machine, I'm going to go ahead and use a public IP, give it one. You don't actually always have to. And in the next VM that I set up, I'll show you how to set one up without that. And then we're also going to go ahead and it doesn't need a NIC network security group. So it doesn't need an interface security group because we already have it in this subnet, and this subnet has a security group. I prefer to manage my security groups on subnets because then it's easier to put everything together according to task versus having to manage each individual machine. It's just a lot more efficient, and to be honest, you're less likely to make mistakes. We don't need any accelerated networking or load balancing, so we'll move on to management. Okay, we're going to leave this pretty standard. We're not going to turn on any of that. Okay. Let's see, we don't need any of this advanced extensions. Tag, we're going to use that same tag we've been using. So we're going to review and create. Okay, so it's passed its validation, everything's good, and we're going to create it. Okay, this is very important. because this is your private key. This is what you're going to be using to prove to the VM that you are who you say you are. This is a lot better than using a password, so I highly suggest doing this. At the same time, make sure you store this somewhere very, very secure, because you don't want someone to have your private key. The other thing is you'll only be able to do this once. So we're going to go ahead and download the private key and create the resource. Just so you know, on this particular computer that I'm downloading this on, I actually have quite a bit of security monitoring software. So it's relatively secure. So now my tutorial private key, which is the .pem, and I'm going to be moving that out of that downloads folder. I'm not going to keep it in a default folder like that. That's not particularly protected. I'll be moving that to a secure place. Some people like to keep them on an external drive or an external storage device so that they're not even on a device that's active most of the time. There's also key store management programs you could download that will manage those keys and keep them encrypted for you and such like that. So I suggest you look into that, especially if you're doing this for purposes of business and production. So these can take a little bit for the deployment to get fully set up. Just depends on the availability of resources and speed of everything. So I'm going to go ahead and let it do its thing. Oh, there we go. Deployment is created. I like how fast it is most of the time. So we can go to resource, and you can see that it's up and running and waiting for me. The public IP address is here, and its private IP address on that subnet is right here. So notice it's been given .4, but when I SSH into it, I'm going to be using this one. So like I said, for this particular server, I'm going to be using SSH. You have two options. If you're on a Windows machine, you can use something like PuTTY and its key management system to SSH into it directly, or you can use OpenSSH on a Linux machine, or actually I'm pretty sure you can do that now on a Windows machine. However, I'm not going to demonstrate it because directly SSHing into a machine is actually not the most practical way, nor the most secure method of getting into these things, of getting into cloud management systems. Usually you want to use something called a Bastion server, which is one single point that you remotely get into. You log into that remotely, and then from there you travel within the subnet. So like for instance, we set this one up with a public IP. So we would want this to become our Bastion server if we were going to manage it ourselves. So from what we would do is we would SSH only to this public IP, and the rest of our VMs wouldn't have public IPs. We would just use this one using OpenSSH, and we would communicate within the subnet on port 22. But the next resource that we'll set up is an even better option when using Azure, which is a managed Azure Bastion service. And I'll demonstrate that next, because it is the recommended way to access all your VMs and resources when using Azure. Okay, one thing I did want to show for anyone who just wants to get right into their VM, you are going to have to put a rule that allows you to do this into your security group. So what I did was I went to my security group resource, and I'm going to go into the inbound security rules, and then I'm going to have to go to add. And what I'm going to do is, what you would do if you wanted to do this is go ahead and tie it to whatever public IP address you're going to be accessing it from. This way only you or other certified users people that are allowed can actually try to get into your system. You don't want to just leave port 22 out there by itself open. So you're going to put IP address. Now I'm not going to put an IP in here for this demo because I don't want to show the public IP I'm using. So I'm just going to remind you that you put your public IP, and you can find that. If you don't know how, you can use something called what is my IP, and it will let you know, or you can check on your router settings and it will also tell you what your current public IP is. Okay, source ports, you're going to want to leave that just as the asterisk, because your system may use many different ports to send things out. So you're going to want to leave that open. Destination is going to be your virtual network. So you want to leave that as virtual network. You could specify the public IP address of the server that you want to reach if you wanted to, which I guess you could do, especially if you're using it as a Bastion server. That's not a bad idea. Destination port in our case is going to be 22 because it's your SSH. TCP, I'm going to allow it. Go ahead and leave it at a priority of 100. And then the name, we'll just call it SSH admin. And in the description, this is the IP I am SSHing into the server for admin purposes, something like that. Obviously, it doesn't like me just writing public IP, so it's not going to let me click add, but that's what you would do. And that's actually how you create inbound rules as well. Again, it's very similar to managing a firewall. But like I said, for the purposes of this tutorial, I'm going to show you a better practice, which is using a managed Azure Bastion service. The first thing we need to do before we can put in a Bastion service is we need to go to tutorial network here. And we need to set up a subnet that's going to be used. So we're going to go ahead and create the subnet by going to our tutorial network. And then they have a very specific name that they like you to use. So Azure Bastion subnet. This IP block will be fine. And then we're not going to change any of those. Okay, so we're adding the subnet in. Okay, it's been successful. Okay, go back here. We're going to create a resource now. We're going to go ahead and just look it up in the marketplace. And then we're going to go ahead and click create. Same resource group, Azure tutorial. We're going to use our same naming schema, so we'll just call this tutorial Bastion. Choose our virtual network. It automatically knows which subnet it wants to put in there. Give it a new IP. Tutorial network IP will be fine. Or its IP name. Then we're going to use those tags I created for this. The tags are also useful, by the way, when you're calculating cost, because you can use the tags to calculate the cost of the entire project by using them in your calculator application that they provide on Azure. So that's another reason that it's good to use tags to put everything together that's the same project. Okay, so review and create. It's been validated, and we're going to create it. So now that we have our Bastion server set up, I'm going to demonstrate how to use it to connect with our virtual machine. So what we want to do is come into our resource groups here, and we'll go to Azure Tutorials, and this will show the resources we've made. Here's our virtual machine, tutorial VM. So we'll click on that. Now notice over here we have connect, so I'll click connect here, and then we're going to choose the way we want to do this. So we're going to want to connect with our Bastion. Okay, it's going to ask us for our username, which is Azure user in this case. and then it's going to ask us authentication type. I'm going to do private key from a file, and go ahead and choose that private key. You downloaded it before, and then connect. This is going to be a pop-up, so if you have a pop-up blocker on, you're going to have to allow it to do this. Of course, allow, and there we are. We're inside. This is our server. So that's how you connect using a Bastion host provided by Azure. It's a very good method. As you can see, this wasn't actually done over SSH. This was done over encrypted HTTPS. So it's a much safer method to use than SSHing from your home or your work even. Much more protected. Okay. Now we're going to make another virtual machine, this time a Windows operating system, so we demonstrate that and how to use the Bastion server to log into it. This time it's going to be a Windows server, so we'll go over how to do that. So we're going to go to create a resource, and then we'll go to compute. Now we could do the whole thing from virtual machine, but if you'll notice, they have some preset ones, and I thought they had a Windows preset, but they have a SQL server, but that's not what we want to make. So we'll just do it from scratch here, virtual machine. So go ahead and choose that. I'll show you how you change it anyways that way. Okay, so we'll check this as a tutorial for our resource group. We're just going to call this tutorial Windows VM. Okay, it doesn't like my underscores. Okay, I'm not going to do any redundancy. Okay, so this is where we change the operating system, where it says image. We're going to come down here and we're going to choose, we'll choose the newest one, Windows Data Center. I'll leave that because that's what it's. We'll create some sort of username for it. I'm just going to choose something simple. Tutorial user. And then it's going to want me to create some sort of password. So I'm just going to create one for these purposes. Make sure you create a very strong password, obviously. Okay. We're going to go ahead and tell it to use RDP for selected inbound. Okay. Okay. Yeah, we're going to want RDP available. But to be honest, we're going to put none because we don't want it from the internet. We're going to be doing it from our Bastion host. So we're going to put none because we don't want that to be open. Oh, they want it longer. Okay. I guess I tried to simplify that too much for the video. And they must match. What did I do? They're not matching. Okay, hold on. Something's funny. There we go. Now they match. Sorry about that. Okay, so next is going to be disks. We'll just leave, well, we'll actually go to standard SSD. I'm going to leave it as SSD standard. It's Windows, so it probably needs a little extra oomph. For networking, we want to put it in the tutorial network, but we're going to move it to our tutorial subnet. Public IP, we're not going to have one. Remember, we're going to be getting this through our Bastion. We don't want people to be able to try to hack into it from the outside. It's not going to have a network security group. It's going to just be on that subnet and have the security group that's assigned to that. No load balancing or accelerated networking. And that looks good. We don't need to change any of these. We're going to use that same tag, so all my resources can be looked up at once, and then review and create. Okay, so create it. Okay, the deployment's underway. So that's how you choose different images. As you can see, there are some pre-made images of popular solutions like Microsoft SQL or different pieces, different server stacks you might want. So you want to check out the marketplace. A lot of those are free to use, and they come set up with best practices. You just have to go into the configurations and maybe make some custom changes if you have to. But a lot of it, that's a really good way to get up and running very quickly. Obviously, the demos that we've done, we've just loaded the OS by itself, and anything you want to build, you have to build on top of that. But in reality, you would be using pre-made images or managed services like we did with the Bastion even. The Bastion service, by the way, is yeah, that's definitely it's a SaaS, it's software as a service, so it's pretty useful to have that set up for you. Another benefit of the Bastion, a lot of people do set up their own, jump boxes, as you might call them, where you SSH into one VM, say a small Linux machine, and then SSH or RDP into the others from there. But the reason why I also prefer the managed service is that way it's being updated, and security patches and such are being maintained by Azure. So you don't have to worry about that. You don't have to worry about, wait a minute, I haven't updated the jump box in a while, is it going to be vulnerable? But if it's a managed service, then they're updating, they're keeping that secure. Again, it's that responsibility model, depending, between what level of service they're providing and how much of your own resources you're using. Okay, so we have our VM now. Okay, so we've created the Windows VM, and so now what we're going to do is we're going to use our Bastion service to connect to it. Again, internally we're going to be connecting using an RDP session, but what's nice is that from the outside we're not using RDP. We're not using remote desktop protocol to get in. We're actually using this just this fully encrypted Azure Portal. The Bastion itself is connecting from within Azure on that private subnet, so it's not available from the outside, except through this encrypted portal that we had to log into, and from our username for Azure and such. Okay, so I've clicked on the tutorial Windows VM. Just like with the Linux server, we're going to click on Connect. Now we're going to click on Bastion, and we're going to go ahead and put the username we had created. I just put tutorial user at the time. Was that capped? I hope not. Okay. Password. I know the password at least. And we're going to connect. Okay, and here we are. We are on the server itself. So you can see, I can bring this up, the start menu, not the start menu of my machine, but the start menu of the server itself. As you can see, it has Server Manager on it. And now I could start giving this server roles. I could set it up, doing whatever I want it to do, whatever I need it to do. Much safer than having that RDP port open to the world. Again, I didn't even give this VM a public IP, so there's no way for anyone to get to it. There's no connection from the internet to this server. Only I can get into it using my Azure Bastion service here on the portal. So it's a much more wonderful setup. It's a much more secure setup. The fact that it's being managed by Azure means that if you lapse in your patching, or you have a lot of responsibilities and such, you don't have to worry about that. So I highly suggest using that. Okay, we're going to stop there in this part one. This is your basic introduction. We went over the concepts of Azure Cloud Service. We talked about the different infrastructures, the different types of cloud, architectures, and then we showed you how to create some of the basic resources to run virtual machines and how to connect to them using a Bastion service. In our next video, we're going to touch on some more advanced topics. We're going to talk a little bit about pricing and how to use the pricing calculator on Azure to estimate how much you're going to be paying per month. So join us then for our intro to Azure Part 2, and thank you for watching this video. Don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, any questions you have, and thank you for watching Skills Build Training.